He was 12 years old the first time he understood that some parts of himself were not allowed to exist out loud. The church said so. The block said so. The men standing on the corner who watched other men the wrong way said so too, except they said it with their eyes cutting, not their mouths moving. He learned the lesson without anyone having to teach it directly. Silence was a kind of armor, and wearing it was how you stayed safe. This is the story of a generation of men who grew up black and gay in America during the 1970s and 1980s, a time when those two identities stacked together could get a man locked out of his own community before he ever got the chance to understand who he was. They are Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, and their coming-of-age years were shaped by forces so heavy that silence became not a choice but a survival strategy. To understand what they carried, you have to understand what America was doing to gay men in those decades. Homosexuality had only been removed from the American Psychiatric Association's list of mental disorders in 1973, just a few years before many of these men were entering their adolescence. Before that, the medical establishment had classified same-sex attraction as a disease. The law in many states still criminalized homosexual conduct. Police raids on gay bars remained common into the late 1970s, and gay men could be arrested simply for existing in spaces where they gathered. That was the world they were born into, a country where who they were was considered both sick and criminal. And then the AIDS crisis arrived. In June 1981, the Centers for Disease Control published the first report of what would eventually be named Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. At first it was called GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency, a label that attached disease, shame, and death directly to gay identity in the American imagination. President Ronald Reagan did not publicly acknowledge the AIDS epidemic until 1985, by which time thousands of Americans had already died. AIDS would eventually kill 324,029 men and women in the United States between 1987 and 1998 alone. For Black Gen X gay men, this was not a distant headline. It was happening to people they knew, to people they loved, to people they might have been. The psychological weight of growing up inside that epidemic cannot be overstated. Researchers studying older gay men who lived through the pre-treatment era of AIDS have documented what they describe as collective trauma, the simultaneous experience of wide-scale death, grief, and suffering, compounded by rampant stigma and the near-total absence of a government public health response, until the virus began to spread beyond gay men and intravenous drug users. Young black gay men in the 1980s were not just watching a health crisis unfold. They were watching a message being sent about the worth of their lives, and the government was the one sending it. But to understand the particular weight that Black Gen X gay men carried, you have to go beyond the AIDS crisis and look at where they actually lived, inside black communities, black families, and black churches. The black church has always been the gravitational center of African American life. It was the institution that organized resistance during slavery, that provided community infrastructure during segregation, that gave black families spiritual grounding in the face of relentless systemic exclusion. To be pushed away from it was to be pushed away from home itself. And for many black gay men, the church made its position clear. Research published in academic journals, including peer-reviewed sociology literature, has documented a significant link between regular black church attendance and more homophobic attitudes among black men. This was not always overt. Sometimes it was expressed through silence on the subject, a silence that communicated that certain people and certain truths did not belong here. Sometimes it was explicit, delivered from pulpits with the full weight of biblical authority and community consensus. Either way, a young black gay man sitting in those pews understood what was being said. He understood that to be fully himself was to risk losing this community that also protected him from everything America was doing to him outside those doors. That double bind, the black church as both refuge and rejection, defined a particular kind of psychological pain that researchers have since confirmed carries serious mental health consequences. Studies have found that black LGBTQ individuals who remain connected to black churches that convey homophobic or heterosexist messages suffer measurable mental health harm from that decision. Yet many of them stayed. They stayed because the black church was also the place that sheltered them from white racism. They stayed because family was there, and history was there, and God, as they understood God, was there. They stayed and they split themselves in two. That same splitting happened in gay spaces. Many black Gen X gay men who did seek out gay communities, the bars, the neighborhoods, the organizations that had formed in cities after Stonewall, discovered that whiteness had structured those spaces just as surely as it structured everything else in America. In the 1970s and early 1980s, black gay men were frequently required to show multiple forms of identification to enter gay bars while white patrons walked in freely. They were excluded, objectified, and made invisible in the very spaces that were supposed to be their sanctuary from a hostile world. Research examining racism in LGBTQ communities confirms what these men experienced directly. Racial minority LGBTQ individuals regularly reported exclusion from LGBTQ events and spaces. The white gay community offered visibility for some gay men, but for black gay men, it often offered them racism with a rainbow flag on it. What this created was a man who belonged nowhere completely. He was black in a white gay world. He was gay in a black straight world. The scholar and author Bell Hooks wrote extensively about how black gay men occupied a uniquely marginalized position in American life, facing racism in spaces organized around shared sexuality and homophobia in spaces organized around shared race. There was no community where he could show up whole. And so he learned, as black Gen X gay men learned, to show up in pieces. The piece that was black went to the family cookout. The piece that was gay stayed hidden. The piece that was hurting went nowhere at all. Sociologists and psychologists have a framework for understanding this kind of fragmented existence. The minority stress model, developed by researchers including Dr. Ilan Mayer, describes the unique stressors that members of stigmatized minority groups face that go above and beyond the stressors of everyday life. For black gay men, the model compounds. They experience minority stress as black Americans in a racist society, and they experience additional minority stress as gay men in a homophobic world. Research has consistently found that gay black men facing both racism in gay communities and homophobia in black communities report significantly higher rates of psychological distress than those who experience only one form of stigma or neither. The intersection was not additive, it was exponential. Silence in that context was not passivity, it was strategy. It was the kind of code switching that black Americans had always practiced in white spaces, knowing when to perform which version of yourself, knowing which rooms required which masks. But for black Gen X gay men, the code switching went even deeper, because the identity they were hiding was not just their race in a white space, but their full self in every space. They learned to compartmentalize with extraordinary precision. One version of themselves was visible. Several versions remained permanently in the dark. The concept that scholars sometimes call the down-low black men who engaged in same-sex relationships while maintaining a public heterosexual identity emerged from this world, though its cultural meaning is more complex than mainstream media representations suggested. The term itself originated in African American vernacular in the early 1990s, simply meaning a desire for privacy and discretion, and it carried the weight of a much older tradition. Researchers have pointed out that strategic secrecy has been part of Black American survival for centuries, from the Underground Railroad to the private networks through which Black communities organized against Jim Crow. For Black gay men navigating the 1980s, keeping their sexuality on the down low was not necessarily dishonesty. It was, for many, the only way to stay alive in every sense of that phrase. Inside the AIDS crisis, this secrecy took on literal life-and-death dimensions. When HIV/AIDS was publicly framed as a gay disease, and when Black communities internalized that framing as one that applied only to white gay men, Black gay men were left without accurate information, without community permission to acknowledge their risk, and without safe pathways to testing and treatment. Studies of Black men who have sex with men have found that experiencing homophobic stigma is directly linked to reluctance to seek HIV testing, lower adherence to treatment, and reduced likelihood of disclosing an HIV-positive status to partners. The shame that the culture installed in these men had measurable consequences in their bloodstreams and their lifespans. Marcus was 47 years old the first time he talked to anyone at all, about what his 20s had been like. He sat in a therapist's office in Atlanta, referred there by his doctor after his blood pressure had reached numbers that made the doctor's face change. The therapist asked him what was going on in his life. He thought about the friends he had buried in the 1980s. He thought about the man he had loved for 11 years who never once used his last name in public, who had died of AIDS complications in 1994 with a family who did not know Marcus existed, who would not let Marcus come to the funeral. He thought about the Sunday mornings in the church his grandmother had raised him in, singing in the choir with his whole voice while the rest of him stayed silent. He said, "I think I've been holding something for a very long time." The therapist nodded and said, "Yes, I can see that. What survivors of that era carry is not something that therapy sessions alone can dissolve." Researchers studying older gay men who came of age during the AIDS crisis have found that the trauma is multi-layered and deeply embedded, built not from single incidents, but from the accumulated weight of years of grief, concealment, and survival in conditions that were designed to make them invisible. The psychological concept of anticipatory grief, grief for losses you can see coming but cannot stop, was something many Black Gen X gay men lived with as a constant companion throughout the 1980s. They watched friends die. They watched the government not care. They watched their communities not acknowledge it, and they kept going to work. They kept going to church. They kept being strong. The mask of strength is something Black men in America have worn for generations, for reasons rooted in the specific conditions of Black life in this country. Traditional masculinity norms, emotional restrictiveness, self-reliance, toughness, are reinforced across American culture, but take on particular weight in Black communities where strength has been necessary not just as a social performance, but as a literal defense against systemic violence and exclusion. Research confirms that adherence to traditional masculinity norms strongly predicts reluctance to seek help, as the very act of asking for help requires emotional vulnerability that conflicts with what it means, in those cultural frameworks, to be a man. For Black gay men, this norm was reinforced by the hypermasculine ideal that their communities held up and the implicit message that being gay meant failing to meet it. They compensated. They overcompensated. They became the most capable person in every room they entered. They became providers, protectors, fixers, the man everyone called when something needed to be handled. They became so good at functioning under pressure that nobody ever thought to ask them what it was costing. The research literature describes this pattern, what some scholars call the John Henryism hypothesis, where individuals who face high levels of chronic social and psychological stress cope by working harder and harder, expending enormous physical and psychological resources, to maintain the appearance of thriving, while the internal toll accumulates unseen. And then there were the ones who found each other. In the margins of cities, in apartments and private spaces, in church choirs where the men who sang soprano knew each other's real names without ever saying them out loud, communities formed. They were not called communities. They did not advertise their existence, but they were real. They were the spaces where black gay men in the 1970s and 1980s could exhale, where the masks came down, where someone else knew your whole story, where grief and love and laughter existed together in the same room. These networks kept people alive in ways that no study has ever been able to fully quantify, because they operated invisibly, out of necessity, in the gaps that mainstream society had no interest in looking into. The cultural production that came out of that world, the art, the music, the fashion, shaped American culture in ways that went largely uncredited. Black gay men were foundational to the ballroom scene, documented in films and television decades later. They were present in the house music that emerged from Chicago and New York in the 1980s, in the black church traditions that built the sound of gospel and rhythm and blues, in the literary and intellectual circles where thinkers like Essex Hemphill and Marlon Riggs were building a language for black gay life that had never existed before. They were creating something from nothing, in the dark, under pressure, while grieving. Essex Hemphill, the black gay poet and activist who emerged from Washington, D.C., and whose work in the early 1980s and 1990s gave voice to the specific experience of black gay men, wrote with devastating clarity about what it meant to be invisible in multiple directions at once. He wrote about racism in gay spaces and homophobia in black spaces, with the precision of someone who had spent years living in the gap between them. He died of AIDS-related complications in 1995 at age 38. His work remained largely outside the mainstream cultural conversation for decades after his death, which was itself a kind of statement about whose stories got told and whose got filed away. Today, the black Gen X gay men who survived that era are in their mid-40s to early 60s. Some of them are out now in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1985. Some of them are not. Some of them found partners and built lives. Some of them never stopped performing the version of themselves that the community required. Some of them sat down with therapists or counselors in middle age and began, for the first time, the work of unpacking what it had cost them to survive. Research indicates that LGBTQ individuals of color who experienced anti-gay rejection from their families and communities face significantly elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and trauma-related symptoms across their lifetimes. For black Gen X gay men, those symptoms often arrive late in midlife, when the body finally stops being willing to hold what the mind has been managing for 40 years. The blood pressure that sends a man to the doctor. The insomnia that doesn't have a name but has been there since 1987. The grief that emerges in unexpected moments for people who died decades ago. The difficulty trusting anyone with all of who you are, because you spent so long learning that being all of who you are was dangerous. These are not personal failures. These are the predictable consequences of surviving conditions that required a man to be invisible to stay safe. What the psychology literature now understands, and what these men lived before the research existed to describe it, is that silence, when sustained over years and decades, becomes a form of chronic stress with measurable physical and psychological consequences. Internalized homophobia, which researchers define as the process by which a stigmatized individual incorporates negative cultural messages about their group into their own self-concept, has been linked to depression, anxiety, risk behavior, and reduced likelihood of accessing health care. For black gay men carrying both internalized racism and internalized homophobia, The double weight of two different systems of stigma pointed directly at them. The psychological burden was extraordinary, and they carried it without being asked how they were doing, because being asked would have required being seen. He is 53 now. He lives in a city where nobody from his childhood neighborhood knows his address. He has a partner of 12 years who understands, most days, what the silences mean. On Sunday mornings, sometimes he still goes to church, a different church than the one from his childhood one, where the pastor has not made things specifically uncomfortable, where he sits in the back and sings with his whole voice and lets some small part of him remember the boy who loved God and had nowhere to put that love safely alongside everything else he felt. He has not forgiven everything. He is not sure forgiveness is the right word for what he is working toward. He is working towards something, though. Every Sunday he gets in the car and goes. That is what survival looks like. Sometimes not wholeness, not resolution, but the slow, quiet, deliberate decision to keep going. Before pride became public, before the flags and the parades and the corporate sponsorships and the mainstream visibility that younger generations now grow up inside, there was the survival that happened in the dark. There were the Black Gen X gay men who navigated a world that did not want them whole, who were black in spaces that hated their sexuality and gay in spaces that hated their blackness, and who somehow found within themselves, and within the small communities of people who knew their real names, the resources to keep living. That survival did not make the news. It was not documented in real time, but it was real. And it shaped the lives of an entire generation of men who learned, before they were old enough to have language for it, that strength is not the absence of pain. Strength is what happens when you carry the pain and keep moving anyway. That is the psychology of Black Gen X gay men. That is the silence. That is the survival. And that is a story that deserves, finally, to be told out loud.